So what's your church context? Is it part of a denomination? Is it independent in different ways? What kind of church is it?
We are non-denominational, and
Okay.
we intentionally meant to be that way.
Yeah.
We broke out of a United Methodist Church context, you
Okay.
know,
Okay.
here in Tampa. Now,
Sure.
Methodism is very different depending on what parts of the country you're from.
Absolutely.
Methodism in Los Angeles or California is very, very liberal as compared to right here in Florida, which is more the Bible Belt area. So it's a
Right.
little bit different, And then I got a friend of mine who is a Methodist pastor, and he's very ultra liberal in some ways, and then some other Methodist pastors can be very conservative. So
Sure.
it depends a lot.
Okay. Okay.
Methodists just came out of their general conference where they were debating the uh, inclusion of LGBTQ into the church. Should they marriage, and also pastors. So
Right.
it seems to me that the thing that kind of kept the Methodists from going down that route was actually global Methodism. Because if it
Yeah.
had just been left to the American Methodist Church, it would
Mhm.
have passed.
Right.
But on account of the fact that the global South,
Yeah.
Latin America and Africa and parts of Asia have an equal vote on the system, they were not able to pass that, which does not spell something good for Methodism in America right now because it seems like it's going to be a schism now. There's
Yep.
going to be a bit of a split.
Mhm.
So, well,
Yeah.
anyway, that was kind of the
Yeah.
background for a lot of the people from my church. They came from that kind of Methodist background.
Okay.
And they're very different. Some of them are very modern and very liberal in terms of the LGBTQ agenda in the church, and
Mhm.
they have this kind of mentality that God loves everybody and therefore accepts everybody, And so, regardless of what sexuality, that's the big thing on the agenda right now in a lot of churches in the 21st century. And
Yeah.
I think that was one of the topics that you wanted to talk about also, like sexuality and how that's handled in among Christian circles. That's a
Yeah.
huge can of worms.
It is. It is. So I certainly am not going to lay down the once and for all
Right.
pronouncement on it. Yeah, I think it's worth talking about because it is so prevalent, one for
Yeah.
one. And for another thing, I think, I mean, I don't want to generalize. Every church community is different. Every school is different. It seems to me that we have made, and when I say we, I mean evangelical Protestants, generally speaking. And again, I don't know them all. Uh,
Hmm.
it seems to me that we have made progress in our ability to have a conversation, which is a big deal these days because it seems in this country about most controversial issues as a whole, we've gotten worse and worse at just having a conversation.
Yes, I
When was
would
the last time
totally
you
agree.
had a political debate with somebody, right?
Uh-huh.
I mean,
Yeah.
you just sort of given up on coherent conversations in some ways.
Uh-huh.
So I see progress, but I also see a long ways to go,
Yeah.
mainly in the sense that, so I was out at a Bible Institute back east back in January, I think it was, maybe February. And we were there to recruit students. It was one of these one and done sort of institutions. So they're looking for bachelor's degree programs afterwards. So we went out to recruit and introduce them to GNU and so forth. And we got to spend an evening talking with a bunch of students, 30 or 40 students, about sexuality.
Hmm.
And one of the questions that was asked was, what sort of conversations are happening at your school about, let's say, same-sex issues? What's happening, formally speaking? What conversations are you having?
Hmm.
And the answer was none. None at all. Now, kids talk about it in dorms. That's going to happen. Okay, so there are zero instances where the school is saying, "Hey, this is a big issue. Let's get some people together. Let's talk to our students. Let's have a dialogue with them. Let's teach them." No.
Hmm.
Then I asked them, "Okay, how many of you?" And again, there's about 30 or 40 of them. How many of you have a close friend, not just a random acquaintance, but a close friend or relative that
Hmm.
in one form or another, explicitly, implicitly, practicing, not practicing, is wrestling
Yes.
with sex attraction.
Uh-huh.
And every single hand goes up.
Yeah.
No exceptions. So there's a subset, 10% of the student body, 100% of them are dealing with this issue, and there's no conversation happening.
Yeah.
That we are not going to win,
Uh-huh.
whatever you think winning means in this sense. We are not going to have a successful conversation. We're not going to train our students to handle it well in the culture if we talk about it, because it's everywhere. You can't
Yeah.
avoid it. So there's a couple of resources that you probably know about these that are really good. One is by Wes Hill. Wes Hill is a celibate gay Christian man. He's also a New Testament professor.
Okay.
He wrote a book called Washed and Waiting, which is mostly his testimony. It's not a biblical, let's talk through the text, let's do the exegesis. It's more of a testimonial.
Okay.
It's essentially him saying, this is my experience of being same-sex attracted. I believe the Bible teaches that, what he would call a traditional view of marriage, or an Orthodox Christian view of marriage, where same-sex intercourse is not biblically permissible. What do I do now?
Yeah.
And it's a phenomenal, powerful testimony, just telling his story. And what was most helpful, so my students read this for my systematic theology class, and I think the biggest insight that came out of it was students saying, I always thought that people who wrestled with that always had some sort of complicated mess in their background that caused it. An abusive uncle, or an absentee dad, or divorce, or I always thought there was some big obvious mess back there that people to this place. And Wes Hill is very clear. Look, I had a great family. Parents are together. I was never abused. I mean, he just said, look, I had none of those things. Here's who I am. And for students to hear, my students to hear, this sort of thing doesn't just emerge from a particular mess, so that if we just avoided those messes, the whole thing would go away. It isn't going to work like that. So that's a really good resource. The other one is by Preston Sprinkle. Preston Sprinkle also happens to be a New Testament, has a PhD in New Testament, now works at the Center for Faith, Sexuality, and Gender, I think it's called.
Center for Faith, Sexuality, and Gender.
Gender.
Okay.
And he's written lots of things. He's in Boise, up in Idaho, so not too far from here. But he has a book called People to be Loved.
Okay.
And the subtitle is Why Homosexuality is Not Just an Issue.
Yeah.
And so the book is more or less two things. One is he does try to make the biblical case for what he calls a historic Christian view of marriage. One man, one woman, and so forth. So he tries to spell out, and he goes to the text in Leviticus, and he goes to the text in Romans. He's a bit of an expert on Greco-Roman background, so he does the work there. But then alongside that is this constant harping on, you need to treat people a certain way. You need to act a certain way. So he has a great line that I love, where he says, I doubt that the prostitutes and tax collectors ever walked away from Jesus wanting to kill themselves.
Yeah.
Which is precisely what he has seen happen in the LGBTQ community. They walk away from the way we treat them and commit suicide. He said that there's zero chance that's how Jesus wants us to treat people.
Yeah.
So he tells a lot of hard stories about that. And it's just, again, so these are two books that are comfortable for me in terms of their position on things. So I need to read some more books that push me a little bit on that. But these two that I'm going to align myself with theologically, that are so helpful and so straightforward in terms of we just are not handling working with people, talking with people, ministering to people, serving people, loving people. We're just doing a terrible job of that. And I think, I know I have my own slant on this. There's plenty of wonderful, godly people that disagree with me, and that's okay. They may change my mind at some point. I am less and less interested in fighting legislative battles. I think
Mm-hmm.
there's probably a place for that, and that's not my arena. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm a lot less interested in that as I am in learning how to treat people better,
Yeah.
in learning how to sit down to have students in my office here who are wrestling with same-sex attraction, or
Mm-hmm.
whose siblings or whose spouses are
Yeah.
wrestling with this. I'd much rather be better at that than at winning votes.
Okay.
Again, there's going to be disagreement on that. I understand that. That's more my slant. Um,
Uh-huh.
but I think when it comes to what it means for the church to win,
Uh-huh.
getting votes our way is not how the gospel defines winning. Now, there's a place for that,
Yeah.
but
Uh-huh.
that's not a win. A win for us is people coming to Jesus,
Yeah.
and sometimes that includes getting the votes, and sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah.
So I think that's going to be my angle on
Yeah.
things.
Uh-huh. Now,
Yeah.
I think from the perspective of the Christian who wants to legislate these things,
Mhm.
or who it's like that Christian baker, the case of the Christian baker, and the couple come into his shop and they want him to make a cake for him, and he refuses
Right.
them, and it goes all the way to Supreme Court. Now, the Supreme Court decision there was a little murky. It's not like they're vindicating him, but
Right.
they're giving him the license from his religious perspective not to do it, but not to make that a precedent for everything else.
Right.
Right?
Right.
So, um,
Tricky.
yeah, from a certain Christian perspective, and mostly from, I would say, the conservative evangelical right, they will fight that legislative battle because they believe that it's actually a detriment to society at large,
Yep.
that it's breaking families and causing issues for the society at large. And so that becomes not just a private Christian sphere, it becomes something that affects everything.
Yep.
And so
Absolutely.
that's why I think in their perspective, they're fighting this from a legislative perspective
Hmm.
also.
So, James,
And
let me ask you what back to the sexuality issue. When someone comes to you, and there's a bunch of different ways to frame this, but if someone comes to your church for the first time,
hmm
and of course they're going to ask, what's your church's position?
yeah,
And you may not even like that question, but that's the one you're going to get probably. What's
right.
the church's position on same-sex marriage or on LGBTQ or something like? How do you navigate those conversations?
Um, I look at, I need to know the person first. I need to develop a relationship with this person who is asking those questions, where they're coming from, whether or not they are involved in a same-sex relationship. Because in the past, I've had a lady who was in a same-sex lesbian marriage, you know, and how do you navigate that is it's I would say I can never look at it in terms of group identity. I need to look at the individual,
Sure.
if you understand what I'm saying, because each individual is very, very unique and very different. And overall, um, I would say our church is aligns with historic Christianity on issues such as that marriage should be between a man and a woman, and kind of like the traditional family kind of thing, if there's such a thing as a traditional family,
Sure.
historically speaking,
Sure. In
but
the
it
sense
is,
of a man and a woman, even if
yeah, yeah. But
after that, right?
like what you were saying, that does not mean that we shun people in any way, shape, or form. There needs to be a love, the relationship that we develop with people who are outside of that, or is to love them, to care for them, and seriously. I'm not talking about just mouth the words.
Right.
It's develop relationships with people. So the lady who came to our church and was involved in a same-sex relationship, loved on her and taught her, and teaching. This is where teaching is so important. Teaching Christianity, teaching what the Bible has to say about certain things, And then when they are ready to come to a place of particular faith, not that they're perfect, but that if they want to take that step into becoming a Christian, opening that door for them to do so and baptizing them. So I baptized this lady after about a year of
Mm.
teaching them Christianity, and they freely came to a place where they want to give their life to Christ. Then I baptized them. Now, at that point, yes, were they involved in that same-sex relationship at that point? No, they were no longer. But it wasn't because we forced them to. They had to make their own choice and decision, and it was a difficult decision. It was very, very difficult for them.
I'm sure it was.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but that's the journey. And so it's not just a one day, one moment thing. It's a relationship. So
Mhm.
for me as a pastor, when somebody comes from that background or asks questions like that, I don't give an immediate answer.
Sure.
I say, let me get to know you. Let's get to know each other. Let's communicate. Let's figure things out together. Let's journey. Let's walk along this path together for a little while. And if you're willing to do that with me, I'm willing to do that with you. And then we'll try to figure out together what to do. That's the kind of long and complicated answer
Oh, that's great.
that I give.
Good.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah.
And I think it's funny. I think part of that loops back into our earlier conversation about the intellectualism and the theology, because
Yeah.
even the fact that today one of the first questions somebody's going to ask is, "What's your position on this?" Right?
Exactly.
So it's come. That fact is, you have to combat some of that mentality with good theology.
You
And
do.
part of it is what you just said about relationships and the knowing the people and the journeying together. And then another part of it is saying, look, it may be in our cultural moment that this is a big issue. It's actually not the most important issue.
Mm-hmm.
And learning with the church how theology has been done actually helps you see that. It turns out your essential doctrine of God is more important than your take on sexuality.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a reason we're going to talk about things like the deity of Christ. And that's interesting, because do we major on the majors? Because in some contexts, the majors are simply whatever the hot button issue of the day is.
Yeah.
Um, that's a problem. The theology of the church guides what you put a lot of emphasis on. Now, I'm not saying those aren't important issues, whatever, things that are going on in the culture. You got to talk to that, but you talk to it from a certain theology. And if you don't have the theology, you're not going to be able to say much.
Yeah.
So I think it just reinforces the idea that fundamentals of the Christian faith have to be taught over and over and over and over, so that when it's time to have a Sunday where we talk about same sexuality,
Mm-hmm.
same-sex attraction, we're ready to have the conversation.
Yeah.
This is something I'm in the biblical study side of things. Teach systematic theology right now. It's a bit outside my comfort zone, but it's something I've come to appreciate so much about my systematic theologian colleagues, is that they just have this ability to walk you all the way through from fundamental ideas and truths to a practical issue.
Okay.
We stereotype the theologians as the abstract, meaningless details, esoteric things, and it's kind of the opposite. In academia, sometimes it's the biblical scholars like me that don't know how to land things. We've got this text over here and this text over here and a little history over here, and the theologians are actually better equipped to say, hey, let me bring it all together for you and show you why a certain understanding of God and creation and Christ and redemption is why we do certain things when it comes to sexuality.
Yeah.
And I think that's so important, as opposed to just a sort of like a quick take, here's our position, moving on.
Yeah.
Which is not what you're doing, which is great. So thank you for that.